At the lip of a hedgerow lane in Normandy, a German corporal lifts his head and hears it before he sees it. A long, low hum like a beehive waking. The hedges are high, their roots tangled in centuries of soil, and the lane is sunken and slick. He looks up through a notch of leaves. The first truck appears as a shadow, then a grill, then a windshield streaked with dried rain and dust. A second follows the first, and then another, and another, and another, until the column becomes a river. The men in the trees stop counting. There is a rhythm to it, headlights hooded by slits of blackout paint, a whisper of downshift, a cough when a driver misses his double clutch on an incline. Canvas tops bow under the weight of crates. A soldier perched on a passenger side step tosses a cigarette butt that skitters and dies on wet gravel. On each truck's tailgate is a stenciled number in white. On some, a red circle is painted on a sign that points the way. An arrow like a wound in the air. Priority convoy route. Red ball. The German corporal thinks it must end. Everything ends. But the line goes on. Between trucks, there is the briefest gap, then more trucks and more. It is not a column. It is a fact that the enemy has more wheels than he has words for. He lowers his head, writes in a small notebook, and tries to describe it simply. Americans and their trucks. So many trucks you cannot believe. We remember World War II as a war of tanks and planes, of beachheads and bridges. But this was a war fought on wheels. Behind every photograph of a Sherman nose out at a hedgerow is an unglamorous procession that made that tank possible. Crates of .3006 and 75mm shells. Rations in khaki boxes stamped with promises of calories. Spare tracks and tank shoes, bandages and sulfa, gasoline and jerrycans stacked like bricks. It all moved in one direction, because thousands of hands and feet, sitting high over crouching 6x6s, made it move. This is the story of how those trucks came to seem endless, of the roads that became one-way arteries, the signs painted with gaudy red dots, the maps held together with pencil and string, and coffee stains. It is the story of drivers, many of them young, many of them black, driving on cat eyes and nerve, 20 hours on and 4 off, through a country whose roads were not built for what was asked of them. It is also the story of men in gray and field green, who watched and could not look away, who measured American might not in battalions, but in axles rolling past, who realized that the battlefield had been enlarged to include every ditch and depot, every crossroad stamped into mud by 1,000 sets of tires. Normandy's beaches were an answer to a question. Could an army be thrown across a sea? What followed asked a harder one. Once ashore, could that army outrun its supply and still win? In the summer of 1944, after the hedgerows blew open at Saint-Lay, and the breakout became a chase across the plains of France, the front sprinted faster than the rails could be repaired, faster than ports could be cleared, faster than planners in England had dared to hope. The American advance was a fire that threatened to outrun its own oxygen. Trucks, plain and ugly, became the bellows. A German corporal, hunched under leaves heavier than shade, watches the river of steel frames flex and exhale. He thinks he has never seen so many vehicles moving in one direction without stopping. A man on a motorcycle roars up the wrong side, an MP at his back, a white armband catching a slip of light. He points, whistles, and the river splits smoothly around a stalled truck, while its driver slides under the belly with a wrench. No one looks confused. Everyone has done this before. The corporal writes one more line. They have rehearsed the act of abundance. If you stand now on a country road in northwestern France in late summer, you can still imagine it. Dust suspended in sunbeams like confetti that never falls. The soft rumble that settles into your bones. The faces of village children counting and not reaching the end. The sensation that modern war so often described as a matter of steel and courage is also a matter of miles, and that miles are counted by the turn of a wheel. When the history of a campaign becomes the story of disbelief, we could not believe how many trucks they had. What you are hearing is a confession that logistics had become strategy, that commerce had become combat, that the most decisive weapon in the American arsenal might have been a truck that carried 2.5 tons and an idea of how to use it. The United States did not improvise its river of trucks on the beaches. It began building it long before. In the 1930s, American roads stuffed themselves with cars and light trucks until driving became a verb as much as a method. Cities grew outward on asphalt. Factories learned the geometry of mass production and the comfort of standard parts. When war came, the same plants that stamped fenders for civilians retooled to press out grills for a vehicle that would become a shorthand for American mobility. The 2.5-ton, 6x6 cargo truck, the deuce-and-a-half. The GMCCCKW and its cousins were simple enough to be fixed with a hammer and a prayer and sturdy enough to carry a small house. America built them by the 100,000. The numbers sound like boasting until you understand that this was not a luxury. It was a design. The transportation course took shape around a motto that was half threat and half truth. Nothing happens until something moves. They taught the math of movement, how much tonnage a road can eat in a day, how many gallons of gasoline a division drinks just to sit still, how quickly tires wear when a convoy runs heavy on warm tarmac. They standardized as if winning were a matter of how many identical bolts could be laid end to end from, say, Kansas to Cherbourg. They built a truck culture. Drivers were trained to make a gearbox sing, to double clutch so the teeth didn't grind, to listen to a downshift, to glance in mirrors that trembled with vibration, and see not just the truck behind, but the idea of the convoy itself spacing equal discipline taught. They learned to read the weather in the way a ton of canvas tells it, in a tug of wind on a tarp. They learned to change a tire in the dark, with a cigarette in their mouth, and a friend's hand holding a flashlight that had a slit of blackened tape for a lens. They learned the language of grease zerks and fittings, and the sweet stink of hot oil. They learned, finally, that a truck is most dangerous when it is empty and you have convinced yourself you are done. There were other machines, of course. Jeeps like metal crickets, buzzing. Jews amphibious trucks. Gucks that waddled ashore with crates of ammunition and sacks of mail. Tankers with sloshing bellies, more valuable, sometimes, than a tank. But the workhorse was the deuce-and-a-half, 6 wheels under a frame, a bed that could carry crates of .50 caliber belts one day, and wounded men the next, sides that could be dropped for speed, or raised to keep dust off bread. It was a simple creature with simple needs, and it allowed a complex thing to happen. A supply line that did not wait for rails. After the landings, the Americans nursed crippled ports back to life. Cherbourg, dragged into service despite German sabotage, coughed up cargo slowly. One of the artificial harbors built off the beaches had been wrecked by a storm. Rail yards were twisted, bridges knocked from their piers. An army consumes even when immobile, and the unit logs became ledgers that would make any merchant proud and any quartermaster lose sleep. X tons of rations per day, Y tons of shells, Z tons of POL, petroleum, oil, lubricants. Some of the fuel came in cans, whose shape was borrowed from the enemy. The jerrycan, a clever German invention, copied, because cleverness respects itself. The rest would, in time, flow in pipes laid across and under seas and fields, but for now, the can and the tank truck ruled. When Operation Cobra cracked the bocage and the American front stood up and ran, the neat, layered supply plan drawn for Normandy tore along one seam and fluttered. Rail repair crews worked with speed and nerve, but rails take time, and the roads, narrow, hedge-lined, ancient, were there. The staff in a drafty chateau mapped the problem. If trucks drove to the front with supply and back with air, they wasted half their miles. If every truck drove any road, they choked each other. The solution, America, reached back to its railroads to borrow. In rail yards, cargo that must move fast rode on red ball trains marked with red discs. Paint some red discs on signs, give the fastest loads a priority route and a halo of rules, and you have a road-borne railroad. You have the Red Ball Express. They built it in days. A one-way loop from Normandy depots through Le Mans, toward Chartres and Paris and beyond, dedicated to supply. One set of roads to the front, another set back to the beach, a river up and a river down, each flowing constantly. Military police manned intersections and cleared French traffic with an authority that cut through language. White gloves, whistles, a sharp gesture. Bridges got extra attention because a river does not matter if it cannot cross itself. Signs bloomed with red circles and arrows that could be seen at dusk. Speed limits were posted and then ignored when a driver felt brave, when a sergeant was behind schedule, when a division on the line called for more fuel, and the men at the wheel understood that being early could mean fewer men bleeding tomorrow. The drivers themselves were a chapter of America, not taught in many schools then. A majority were black soldiers from transportation battalions who had trained stateside on dusty motor pools and had been told, in 100 ways, where the army thought they belonged. Many turned a slight into a skill. They learned French village names faster than officers. They carried quick intelligence from one end of France to the other. A rumor that a bridge was out, that the Luftwaffe had woken up, that MPs were writing tickets on the N12. They formed friendships across units and routes, a brotherhood of steering wheels and coffee in tin cups. They ran from dawn into dawn, navigating by cat-eye headlights and the feel of a road under a chassis. In the cabs, photographs were tucked into visors. A glove scraped mud off a boot heel. A radio played when someone could wire one to a battery without getting yelled at. On the seat beside you, a wrench that only fits one nut but is always there. Under the seat, paper maps curled by damp, pencil lines traced over and over until the paper felt thin. The smell was part diesel, part wet canvas, part tobacco, part something that, years later, makes a veteran stop in a supermarket aisle near the detergent shelves, lost in a time where you could not buy clean. On the shoulder, French civilians stood and watched. Some waved, children counted, faces tipped back. Old men stared and spat smoke like punctuation. German prisoners marched the other way, looked with a mix of awe and grievance. An enemy's abundance tastes like insult. The river flowed both ways. Ammunition and food out, prisoners and wounded, and empty crates back. The calculus of a campaign ran along these lanes. Move enough weight fast enough, and an army sings. Starve it, even briefly, and the song becomes a cough. By the time German soldiers wrote home that they could not believe how many trucks the Americans had, they were not confessing ignorance. They were giving the truest possible measure of what they faced. The road had become as decisive as any ridge or river, and it had been turned into a machine. The Red Ball Express began as a notice on a wall and became a habit. Every habit has rules. Trucks were spaced by doctrine 50 to 100 yards apart. Enough room to brake, not so much that the column could be cut. Headlights were hooded by slits that cupped a thin crescent of light onto the road. Convoy speeds were set by the slowest in the string, because you do not pull a chain faster by yanking the last link. Passing was forbidden, except where signs declared it safe, because a column must act like a thing with one mind if it expects to live through the night. Drivers learned the art of the long shift. You fit yourself into a cab like a tailor into cloth. You know where the clutch grabs, the rhythm of the engine at 30 miles an hour on flat road, the feel of a hill in your knees before the grade announces itself. You know the smell of burning brakes 100 yards ahead because you have set yours on fire before. The sweet tang that means someone forgot to drop a gear early and will pay for it now. You know the hollows where fog sits and will swallow your world and shrink it to the size of a hood ornament. You know the dogleg left at the oak tree, where a gunner once got bored and drew his girl's initials with a knife. Noise becomes company. The hump of canvases, the whine of a fan belt, the brush of branches. Voices in the next cab carried on air like flags. The hiss of air brakes on a tanker makes a man's heart skip. Some loads are easy bread, blankets, boxes of soap. Some feel like carrying a lit match in your teeth, gasoline cans, stacked with the handles facing out, so you can throw them faster if the worst happens. Paul, the manifest says, but you feel it in your bones. When a convoy rolls heavy with fuel, the drivers sit taller without meaning to. They crack windows wider. They stop joking. Danger had its faces. The Luftwaffe flew low at dawn, raked roads with guns that scared more than they hit by late 44, and still sometimes they hit. German columns, when the lines were blurred, would snake across a route at night. MPs would turn a convoy around with urgency that felt like anger. The worst danger was time, because fatigue is an enemy that does not announce itself with a uniform or a flag. Drivers nodded and came awake with a jolt, and a truck half in a ditch. Some did not wake. Crosses and stars sprouted on shoulders, where the road kinked wrong. Officers posted speed traps, not because they loved rules, but because a truck that arrives fast, but dead, has delivered nothing. If a convoy had to make time, it did it together. More road time, fewer stops, food inside the cab, bodies learning to make do with less sleep until the front had its fill. Maintenance was its own war. Tires shredded on cobbles, on stones half hidden in mud. Mechanics worked in orchards turned to motor pools, grease in the grass. Tools laid out on blankets like silver at a dinner party planned by men who knew what could break and when. A truck with a bad axle became a donor. Cannibalization was an ugly word said quickly, and with relief. Take his engine, take my drive shaft, make one good truck out of two tired ones. The parts books became Bibles. You learned that a 7/16 bolt can be polite and a 13/16 can be stubborn. You learned the prayer that begins, please, not the head gasket, and ends with you covered to the elbows in a liquid that lasts longer under nails than memory lasts in a mind. The numbers were a kind of poetry, and the transportation corps recited them like rosaries. So many vehicles assigned, so many on the road, so many tons delivered per day. In the first weeks, the red ball moved more weight than planners had imagined possible along roads they had hoped not to rely on for so long. At its peak, the one-way loop carried supplies in the thousands of tons daily, a blur of canvas and steel that only stopped long enough to be shunted sideways when a bridge could not take the strain. There were auxiliary routes, the white ball, the green diamond, plotted to carry overflow and avoid a kind of traffic jam no one wanted to imagine. Once the rail lines caught up and pipelines surged forward, the red ball slackened and then stopped. Its purpose had been to fill a gap, but while it ran, it felt like a country's muscle rolling down a narrow back road in a hurry to meet a heart. On the seat beside the driver, a letter, a photograph with a crease, a scrap of paper torn from a shipping manifest with a girl's address scrawled on it, because a Red Cross canteen served coffee and donuts at a crossroads, and a laugh was shared and a promise made to write, and both imagined the truck stopping for a while in some future with clean sheets. In the mirror, a jeep with an MP in a helmet as serious as a sermon. Ahead, taillights that are really just the ghosts of taillights. Behind, the dark, which is what makes you press forward, because you only feel safe when you are moving. Sometimes, the day spits out something beautiful because it feels like it must. A flock of birds lifts from a field as an entire convoy passes. They wheel and hang above the trucks like a living thought. A broken-down farmer, his car to ruin, raises his hat as 50 vehicles roll by, and then do not forget him. The last in the line stops. 2 soldiers jump down, heave a wheel back onto a tilted axle with hands that have learned leverage. And the farmer stands, stunned, and then his eyes fill, and he says the one word everyone can understand anywhere: mercy. The convoy rolls on, and the farmer's cart rolls with it, and everything moves in the same direction for a moment. The Red Ball Express burned itself into memory, not because of its name, not because of its speed, but because it turned the ordinary into the heroic. Driving became a way to chase victory. Grease-stained fingers became instruments of strategy. A country that had built its identity around the idea of movement westward, upward, onward, found that the most honest expression of that identity in war was a steering wheel, a gas pedal, a route marked by red circles, and an understanding that the front is not a single line. It is every place you can carry your will to. From the German side, a view of that will was a puzzle. The Wehrmacht was not a primitive army. It had motorized divisions that had flown across France 4 years earlier on wheels and treads. It used trucks with finesse when it could. But even at its peak, it was a patchwork of motor and hoof. Millions of horses hauled German cannon and kitchens, their breath fogged in morning fields on the Eastern Front when nothing else moved. German trucks were a menagerie of brands. Opel, Mercedes, Ford, captured French and Czech and Soviet, each that required different parts and maintenance, and offered its own peculiar failure at the side of a muddy road. An army can survive on improvisation for months. It cannot live on it for years when its opponent is not improvising. By 1944, the Wehrmacht's fuel was a rumor that came and went. Synthetic plants tried to make oil into gas out of coal and sorcery, and bombers trying to erase those plants from maps came in daylight. Rubber was a memory. Tires were retreaded until they were prayers. When the Americans broke free at St. Lai, German officers looked down at their maps and wrote words that translated as overlay and overrun. But in their diaries, their private language gave up metaphor and returned to nouns. Roads clogged with trucks. American kitchen trucks that made hot food appear where we eat cold. Tankers that always seemed full. Jeeps like insects. The men learned that if they entered a French town and saw the remains of a convoy, empty cans, crumbs of K-rations, cigarette butts, there would be a fight that night, because the enemy had wheels and a plan. Interrogations of American prisoners and captured documents confirmed the gut sense. The enemy had built a road system in a country not theirs, and then used it as familiarly as if it had been their own since childhood. They controlled intersections with a precision that was hard to believe. They repaired bridges with frightening speed. They had a class of troops whose business was traffic. The German staff, trained in maneuver and schooled in history, understood that they were watching something only lightly written about in the books. Logistics as doctrine. At the operational level, the impact was blunt. Patton's Third Army ran until it hit a wall. It was not German, but gasoline. He wrote about it with the furor of a man who felt his fists were taped together in the middle of a fight. The Americans chose where to send the fuel the British thrust toward the Netherlands, the American push toward Lorraine, and those choices rippled backwards into the hull plans of the Red Ball, and the schedules of depots and the muscles of drivers who were told to turn left instead of right. The Germans felt those ripples as relief along one front and a thunderhead along another. In the Lorraine campaign, rain and rivers and stubborn German resistance slowed the Americans, and for a moment, the German infantrymen looked across a field and thought, perhaps the trucks have found their limit. But delays were often the shape of the land, not the collapse of the road machine. Bridges over the Moselle were spanned and respanned. Engineers outpaced weather as if that were possible. A pipeline crept forward, flexible pipe, laid by soldiers and pumping stations that wrote their own chapter in the war's quiet literature. Fuel switched, slowly, from sloshing metal in the back of trucks to humming under the soil. The river of trucks became two rivers, one visible, one underground, and the German habit of measuring American power by what rolled by, lost some of its certainty. The disbelief remained, but it had to share space with a different emotion that has its own complicated dignity: respect. The unmatched flood of American vehicles did more than move things. It shaped the battlefield's imagination on both sides. German officers began to plan as if the enemy's ability to be anywhere was a constant. They underestimated sometimes and suffered for it. They overestimated often and wasted strength guarding against ghosts of convoys that had not yet arrived. Troops on outposts learned that if they saw dust rising 30 kilometers away and heard the faint rattle of grills, they had to assume that somewhere behind that there was a line of trucks that was not going to stop. They learned to strike hard and then melt away, because trying to stand in front of that river was standing in front of weather. Meanwhile, the Red Ball and its cousins were teaching the Americans they could do things they had not planned to do. Operation Market. Garden and airborne dash toward the Rhine, strangled the road network with an audacity that felt invulnerable until it wasn't. Hell's Highway jammed and flowed and jammed again. The lesson here is not simple. Trucks cannot fix a strategy that tries to pull more thread than cloth will allow. But even in failure, a convoy logic held its shape. It carried what it could as far as it could go, and then absorbed the hurt of the end and turned to do something else. The drivers did what soldiers always do. Their job, even when the reason their job was asked of them, was a plan that would end with dead parachutists among Dutch fields, and a bridge too far lit by fires that reflected in a river that would not be crossed that week. Back at the hedgerow, the German corporal's notebook is full. He has written about the trucks and the men and the sound. He has not written about the horses, but they are there too, and they will be there all the way to the end. Harnesses creaking, hooves sucking at mud, men with ropes on their shoulders leaning into the weight of a gun carriage. He knows, without wanting to say it out loud, that he is standing in a war that America has mechanized to a degree that makes his own army feel, at times, like it is fighting a cousin of the last war. His disbelief at the number of trucks is both a fact and a verdict. Walk any museum of the Second World War, and you will see airplanes hanging and tanks parked like carnival rides that forgot to leave town. Look, too, for the truck. It is often off to one side, the color of moss and dust, its canvas taut, its story tucked into a paragraph. It does not demand your gaze. It asks only that you pause. The men who drove it are gray now, or gone. Their photographs, taken at doors of cabs with the wheel, turned just so, live in albums next to pictures of weddings and fishing trips. The war they fought is not glamorous, even when it is urgent. But if you squint, you will see in the shape of that truck the outline of a decision that changed the war and a lesson that keeps teaching. An army that moves coherently will often be mistaken for an army that cannot be stopped. The strategic impact is clean to state and hard to overstate. The American emphasis on wheels married industrial capacity to doctrine and turned France from a chessboard into a conveyor belt. The Red Ball Express carried enough weight in a season to outfit armies, and did it on roads built for ox carts by driving like a man who has a job and is late. It did it with disciplined 9Ps at corners, signs that glowed in dusk, mechanics who made parts from scraps. It did it with courage, not the trumpet kind, but the kind that keeps you awake when your eyelids weigh more than your hands, the kind that makes you shut off your engine and coast past a village because someone heard a plane, the kind that has you stop for a farmer's cart even when the schedule screams. It affected the enemy. German soldiers' disbelief in American trucks was not a marvel at luxury. It was recognition of a kind of genius, to make mundane things operate at the edge of heroism. To eat hot food under a sky that tries to take your head off feels like sorcery to a man whose soup is cold. To see an enemy replace a bridge overnight is to realize you are fighting a country where people trained for a decade to do exactly that quickly, and for money before anyone asked them to do it for death. To watch an American convoy, and think they have rehearsed the act of abundance is to understand that the rehearsal is the act. There is a human cost that belongs on the ledger. Drivers died. Accidents killed more than bullets. Fatigue cut men down in their prime. Racism cut them twice, once with the insult of lowered expectation, once with the silence after a job well done. The Red Ball Express was run, in large part, on the backs and hands of black soldiers who were only decades removed from the plantation. They drove through towns in a liberated France that cheered them, and then came home to streets where uniforms did not make white men respectful. Later films told part of the story, but blurred the faces to make the past more comfortable for the present. The truth is plainer. America asked these men to move mountains on wheels. They did, and only long after did the country start to say thank you with the fullness of its mouth. There are also the quieter heroes, the traffic officer whose whistle sliced through fog, the depot clerk who knew where everything was because he carried 1,000 maps in his mind, the French road worker who patched a crater at 2 a.m. because a convoy needed his patch more than a plan, the engineer who calculated the load a tree-lined bridge could take and was right. War is a backlit photograph in which a few figures are famous and many are silhouettes. Look closer. The silhouettes are where the weight is. What remains for us is not simply admiration. It is attention. The next time you open a history book and read about a dash or a stand, ask yourself what was on the road behind the man in that paragraph. How far did a gallon of gasoline have to travel to be poured into that tank? How many tires were needed for a pursuit of 200 miles? How much sleep did the driver of the truck that carried the plank that became the bridge that carried the infantry get in the 48 hours before he drove? These are not small questions. They are moral ones as much as intellectual, because they teach you to notice the labor that lets courage appear. German soldiers couldn't believe how many trucks the Americans had. It's a sentence that reads like a boast. Read it instead as a mirror. It reflects two truths. 1. Abundance employed with discipline can look like genius. 2. To create such a picture, a democracy must decide to turn factories into arsenals, citizens into drivers, individual desires into a shared path, and then to step back and let organization do its quiet work. In a farmhouse somewhere in France, one of those drivers sat at a table for a few minutes between loads. A woman he did not know poured him coffee. The window rattled every time another truck rolled past. He rubbed his eyes with fists that had grease ingrained into the lines. He looked at his watch. He had to go. He stood, pulled on his jacket, and left. Outside, on the verge of the lane, a German prisoner stared, and then shook his head and smiled a thin smile that meant many things: disbelief, resignation, a little admiration, a little envy. The driver climbed into his cab, turned the key, and the hum joined the larger hum. The truck is an ordinary thing. It asks for fuel and oil, and a driver who will listen. It gives back miles. It is a bargain. In wartime, it is also a promise. If you keep them moving, you might move a country through the worst thing it has ever done to itself. If you stop, not because you are wise, but because you are tired, things fail that cannot fail. The people who understood this best wore no medals for it, and would be embarrassed to be asked to put them on for driving. So here is the quiet call. Remember to look for the wheels. When you see a column of armor in a photograph, see the trucks behind it. When you hear about a victory, listen for the hum in the hedgerows. And when someone tells you that wars are won by guts and fire alone, tell them about a road in Normandy that carried a river 2 ways at once, and about a soldier under a hedge who could not believe it because he was, in his way, honest. The last truck goes by. The dust settles. In the lane, 2 tracks polished to a sheen by 1,000 tires gleam in late light. A child steps out, touches one gleaming strip with a toe, and draws back. It is warm. That warmth is the temperature of history when it is still being made.